If you're in the process of burying a loved one, you're considering cremation, disinterment, or maybe there's a conflict within the family about which path to follow, this is what families need to know. I'm here with Anton Kaminsky, Kaminsky Law. Explain first cremation and disinterment, and what are the situations that happen in families when there's maybe a conflict or disagreement about what to do?
Sure. So everybody knows what cremation is. I'll spend a minute on what disinterment is. Sometimes, for whatever reason, somebody needs to be moved from their grave space, or somebody wants to move somebody from their grave space. Maybe they were interred in a cemetery that was a low-cost cemetery that, 20 years ago that we didn't have money or whatever. And now, the whole entire family has a set of graves over here. And so we want to put them over here with the family. So the concept of disinterment is to actually dig somebody up and move them to another location. It's rarely done, but it is done in some instances in some cultures.
Okay.
So the law on cremation and disinterment used to be that you needed to have a unanimous next of kin approval to cremate or to disinter, or to really, if somebody's got a will and they want to change some sort of funeral arrangements, you needed to get unanimous buy-in from the next of kin. So if there's 3 brothers and sisters, all 3 of them had to have approved it, right?
And this may be an obvious thing, but if it's, dad dies and there's just mom makes the decision. There's no unanimous approval that has to happen there.
That's true. And we could go through a long list of, it's called probate. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on probate.
Okay.
There is, yes, if mom dies and mom's married to dad, dad gets to make the decision. If dad dies, they're still married, then mom gets to make the decision. But if mom dies and dad's already dead, then it's the next of kin would typically be the children.
And
right?
Probate, just for people listening, is like the laws are in the rules regarding who gets to make those decisions. I imagine it gets infinitely more complicated if there's stepmoms and divorces and all those different things probably really complicate things.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're here to talk about. We just want to understand that next of kin, the siblings, the parent,
right?
Or
assuming the last living parent dies.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Let's do it that way. Let's say it's the last living parent dies, or for brothers and sisters, right? If let's just say there was 3 brothers and sisters, and the parents are already gone, and one of the siblings dies and they're not married, so their siblings would actually make the decision too.
Okay, that's good to know.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about kind of that world where you have multiple siblings and they're supposed to make a decision of what happens either to a parent or to a sibling that was never married.
Okay.
And so the law used to be that it was unanimous. You needed a unanimous decision from the next of kin to do.
And making it simple, I've got 3 siblings. We want to do a disinterment because we have this one of the siblings maybe wants to do that. The second sibling agrees. Third sibling goes, no, I'm not comfortable with this. And we cannot.
It puts it at a standstill.
Okay.
And what winds up happening is they have to potentially go to court. There's this concept called Orphans Court. It doesn't just speak to orphans. It speaks to all sorts of family issues. And they would potentially have to go have a judge make a decision of whether or not this person should be cremated. Or the default would be, no, they won't be cremated. No, they won't be disinterred. Right?
Just because one person has blocked that.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
And so the laws recently changed. I don't know exactly when, but it's within the last several years. And law now is majority. And so what winds up happening is now if you have 3 siblings, 2 of their buy-in, right? If you have 2 siblings, it's interesting because now it's still unanimous, right? Because you need both of them for it to be a majority. And we've seen actually a lot of kind of calls and casework around this kind of issue where either a funeral home will cremate somebody without the majority rule, or a cemetery will perform a disinterment without a majority approval, or one of the family member, one of 3 next of kin will call us and say, well, I objected to the cremation and you cremated anyway. Well, unfortunately that's no longer something that's a case. It's now that's completely lawful. And so that's an interesting thing to know, interesting thing for people to think about, and an interesting rule change. And we should talk about how that's impacted the cemetery and funeral kind of conduct.
Right.
And it's an interesting question, to put out there is now whose obligation is it to make sure that you have the buy-in of the next of kin, right? And that you're even identifying all of the next of kin.
Yeah, I imagine that's where, before we get into that, because I think that's going to really be important for everybody to know, right? For owners on the cemetery side to have their right processes in place, but then also siblings that are going into this situation to know what their rights are and what that situation could look like. And we've done all these videos about red flags and things to look out for. If a cemetery is not asking those right questions, or they're demanding unanimous agreement versus majority, you should know your rights. But let's summarize really quick where we are right now. At this point in time, the law has changed. It is now just majority rule between the siblings. If there are only two siblings, we still have to have unanimous agreement, correct? And this is for cremation and disinterment.
Yes. Or, changing any sort of burial plans that were already kind of in the works.
Well, let me ask you a side point to that, which probably solves a lot of these problems, are will and testaments, right? So if this already been agreed in a will that's been left behind, like, hey, never disinter me no matter what, right? Are those things that protect against these provisions? Does the cemetery hold on to that information? Who has it? How does that work?
That's an excellent question. And I don't know that I have all the answers to that, but I will say this.
Because I imagine there's so many.
There's usually going to be
details.
one person or maybe a group of people that goes to the cemetery or to the funeral home to direct what happens. And so to some extent, this video should make them kind of think about what they should be aware of and what approvals they need before they even go to the cemetery. And that's what I was going to say about the duty, right? Is let's say there's only two siblings and you guys both agree. Well, that's simple, right? Sure. But if there's two siblings and one of the siblings knows that the other sibling doesn't agree, but they want to do it anyways, and they go to the cemetery and they say, well, either they never say that there's another sibling, right? They say, I'm the only sibling, right. I'm the next of kin. Or they say, hey, yeah, there is another sibling, but I have their approval. It's fine. They're okay with this, right? And then potentially the funeral home or cemetery doesn't track down that other sibling and make sure, right? Or but if this one sibling out of two does something that completely upends what was expected, what's going to wind up happening, and what a cemetery and funeral home will typically do, is they'll make that person sign what's called an indemnification. And that's a document that says, you're telling us this, we don't know, we're relying on what you're saying. So if we get sued for this, you're going to defend us, and it's on you. And
when you say when you're going to defend us, is that literally, right? Meaning when we think about indemnification, we see this a lot in corporate contracts, right? But when you say that, are you just saying you can't sue us, or are you also saying you're going to defend us? Because that other sibling might come in, guns blazing, they're furious.
Sure.
They're going to come after the cemetery. How could you do this? Cemetery's going to go, your sibling said this was okay. We have this indemnification clause there. That sibling that either intentionally or not intentionally misled the cemetery, do they have to actively protect the cemetery through their legal counsel, or is the cemetery just like, look, I have this indemnification clause, I'm out, it's between you two? What does that look
So the cemetery's not out.
Okay.
It depends on what the indemnification clause says to really see what your duty and obligation is. But the practical aspect of it is, if you're sibling number two in that situation and you didn't know, or the person lied, or they just didn't mention you, or nobody checked with you, right? Or maybe acted against your express, and maybe you've already put your express wishes on the record somewhere and they just disregarded it, right? And so you're going to pursue the cemetery. You're going to say, well, it was your job. The law says you got to get majority consent. You didn't get majority consent. They're going to say, well, this guy said he was the majority or the only person, right? And you're going to say, well, I don't care. They don't have an obligation to me. You have an obligation to me, to the cemetery. So that second person is going to do is they're going to sue the cemetery. And then what the cemetery is going to do is they're going to turn around and sue the person that made the funeral arrangements, right? And they're going to say, well, if we have to pay, somebody a bunch of money for this, it really has to be you that pays it. And so, it is a word of caution for people that are going to do this. Make sure you have the buy-in, right, from your family. And B, make sure that when you're, directing funeral plans or making representations on behalf of the family, uh, read what you're signing. Like, what are you promising to do if this turns out to be incorrect?
In the indemnification situation with the cemetery that's turning around and resuing you, right, for, the position that you put them in, is there any sort of protection that you have or any additional onus and responsibility on behalf of the cemetery that, like, for example, if it went to court and it was like, all you did was take this person's word, have them sign this indemnification clause, you didn't call anybody, you didn't do any extra legwork, not okay. Like, you're not completely safe. Yeah.
This is the question that, we have in front of us now, right? Is what duty, what obligation does a funeral home or a cemetery have to, the people that it's serving to make sure to investigate, to perform any investigation?
And is that going to be defined judge by judge at that point? Because it's a question.
Judge by judge, jury by jury, potentially. There's a couple of factors that we've seen that, sway it one way or another, right? So for instance, let's just say you're disinterring somebody that was interred 3 years ago, okay? And, at a minimum, shouldn't the cemetery go in and check their own records to see who they had listed as the next of kin when you interred them 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you gave directives 3 years ago and there's 3 next of kin, and now there's only 1 next of kin saying he's the only next of kin, well, what happened to the other 2? It's at least a question you can ask, right? So if they don't check their own records, I would argue that that's, huge negligence. Yeah. At a minimum, you should check your own records.
Right.
The next question is, how above and beyond do they need to go, right?
Right. You send an email, they don't respond, or you send a text, they don't respond.
Well, what if they don't even identify you, right? They never identified a next of kin. Now, there's systems out there, public record searches that aren't super expensive. You could do a public record search. Maybe, look, the question is, we were just talking about laws with should funeral homes have insurance, right? And maybe a funeral home should charge an extra $50, right, out of the $5,000 that they're already charging,
right,
for a record search to confirm that this person is who you say they are and that you are the next of kin the way that you say they are, or whatever.
And I want to highlight that because one of the things we've talked about in more of the corporate law space that you play in is that you are business first in terms of your practice as an aggressive attorney. And I love that you position that as not just, hey, go take on this expense, cemetery, but you're saying you can build this into your process, into your systems, that, hey, we're absolutely happy to do this. We have to do a record check just to see if there's any next of kin to protect ourselves. We follow it as a best practice. It's going to be part of the fee structure. You're signing off and acknowledging that you're allowing that. In some of the more complicated situations, and this is probably not true for a lot of people, but like, what do you do in a situation where, and actually this is probably part of the problem that we're dealing with, what I'm about to identify. You have siblings that don't talk, or you have a sibling who maybe even is going through struggles that, mentally ill, alcoholism, they're dealing with these things where they weren't of sound mind at the time that the disinterment or the cremation, which is, was being
it's
requested.
A final type of thing.
And right. Yeah. You can't really undo that with a disinterment. I think we all want to observe the rest in peace idea, and you don't want to do that too many times, but it's more reversible. But like, what do you do in a situation where, maybe you reach out to next of kin, you do these things, and the person was like, they were backpacking in Europe for 4 years without a cell phone. We could not get a hold of them. And now they've come back and complained. Well, I guess in that we hit statute of limitations. I just answered my own question.
We potentially hit statute of limitations issues. We potentially hit, if you've made, well, look, something like a cremation is, as you said, it's this kind of like final thing that you can't undo, which is why, you want this majority approval. And so if you have a person who is, backpacking across Europe with no cell phone for 4 years and you can't get a hold of them, have there been efforts, right? Did you make efforts? And maybe the answer is if you can't, you can't, right?
Okay. And that's going to be judge to judge at that point, right? So
and that's where you have the Orphans Court, right?
Yep.
So the idea is, if let's just say there's 2 siblings and one sibling is just off the map, right? Yep. Well, then there is a step that you should follow as good practice, is you have to say, okay, well, there is this other sibling. For whatever reason, they're unreachable, or they're, not somebody that we're going to get any sort of meaningful response from. So that means you should go to the Orphans Court, and it's a relatively simple filing. You go to the Orphans Court, you get the approval, you disclose this stuff to the Orphans Court. You say, so-and-so is backpacking across Europe. We try to call him. We try to track him down. We post it on his Facebook. He's not responding, whatever, right? We need this order to cremate because this is what they wanted. And then the judge would make that decision. And then you've had that decision, and now you can.
So you just said something that I think is really critical, and I want to really put a big flag on this for people, to acknowledge. I think, and I imagine a lot of our lay people in the law, the listeners, kind of had Orphans Court in the, okay, I've already messed up, or there's a problem, and now we're going to Orphans Court. I don't think I understood that could be a front-loaded aspect of things.
Absolutely.
And so it's really important. I want to just hit that point right now is in your workflow and process, and maybe this is something for cemeteries too, to build into their process to educate their clients, right? Is that if you're going to do this change and you don't know that you're going to be in a position where you can truly get majority buy-in on this decision, go to the Orphans Code. There's steps. Do the reach. Make sure to document. Go to Orphans Court, right? If someone is maybe not in the right mental state or whatever. And do you feel like there's an onus on cemeteries, or it would be beneficial to cemeteries to at least provide this education, or demand that they get some sort of documentation from the Orphans Court?
I absolutely think there is, and I think the Pennsylvania courts kind of do think there is too, and so does the Pennsylvania legislature. The way that litigation works and the way that liability works is you're always, there's two things that are fundamental to our legal system. One is like, what would the fair thing to do be, right? And we've talked about what would the fair thing to do be in every single kind of instance of the law. The second one is, who's in the best position to mitigate this risk, right? And you just hit the nail on the head, is a layperson doesn't really know what the law is. They don't really know what the standards of practice is. And they're usually doing these burials or, arrangements only a few times in their life. And this might be the first time that they're doing it, right? Meanwhile, the cemetery, this is their business. This is what they do. And they do this every single day. And they should be training their employees on how to do this properly. And they should know these processes, and they should have, policies and procedures in place of what boxes need to be checked in order to do something as, final as a cremation, or something as potentially, disturbing to the psyche as a disinterment, right? Somebody's been buried for 20 years. Why are we digging them up, right?
Yeah.
So these are very, big deal things. The cemetery should know, or the funeral home should know, that these are big deal things. And, I am of the opinion that the fair and, who's in the best position to mitigate for this risk does fall in the cemetery and does fall in the funeral home. And like you said, and I think you said this really, really wisely, is they do have the ability to pass along that cost, right? And it's not an obscene cost. It's not a thousands of dollar cost. Like running a public record search is under $100, probably under $50, right? And
isn't it even possible that you could just make the onus on the client to say, run the public record search? We don't have a staff member to figure that out. Run the public record search, and you need to provide us proof of the public record.
But then it gets into a question of, well, did you run the right search, and who did you search, and what?
Sure.
Sure. So fair. I think the onus really should be on the cemetery or the funeral home, but they absolutely can pass along that cost. You should see some of these funeral, worksheets that show there's so many fees in there, and some of these fees, like you look back at them in hindsight, and you're like, why'd you do that here? Or like, why are you embalming somebody that you cremated?
Right. So that's a different than check your invoices.
Right. But what's another $50 on this $5,000 invoice?
Totally. I think that's a great point. I think where we net out here that I think is really beneficial for both parties, right? If you're on the client side, there are certain steps that you can take before you make this decision on cremation or is it disinterment, and take those steps. Again, probably the target audience for a lot of these things are going to be people that unfortunately have already gone through something, because most people are not.
I wish people searched in advance.
Right. Are not anticipating the issues that they're going to face. And most people don't even think about burying their loved ones. Right.
Sure.
But on the cemetery side, this is what you do for a living. You provide an incredible service to people, right, of helping them move on. But there's a burden with that and there's a responsibility. And I think that we really identified some key things in this conversation that are simple process improvements that you can put in that are actually going to increase revenue potentially, right? Or at least offset any costs, and just protect you. And, look, we always talk about these things from a defensive perspective, but think of it from an offensive perspective. To provide that guidance and proper process for somebody who's grieving, who's maybe even in a different disenfranchised situation with siblings, and you're providing them the steps to go, look, I know you're upset, but these are the right ways to do this. That is something that you're just, at the very best, providing better customer service. And I hate to say that in this environment, but
Absolutely.
that's what you're doing.
And there's such a push at some of these cemeteries, especially some of the larger companies, on selling pre-need, right? They're marketing to you to start your funeral planning early.
Sure.
Right? Okay. Well, then let's document all these things, right? What do I want? What do I want to be done with my remains? Who has the right to decide what happens to my remains, right? And, and then once you've done this, large company, you have records. Go back to those records, because sometimes it's just as simple as like, oh my God, we're selling somebody $30,000 worth of services. We don't care what our previous records say. This is a huge sale and we're getting paid a commission on it. As a consumer, you should understand that this is a company selling you a product or a service. They're incentivized to sell, and to take your money. Make sure you're reading the documents. Make sure you're understanding what you're signing. Make sure you're understanding what you're buying, and make sure that, everything's explained to you. And when people are selling you pre-need, maybe you should do some of these searches in advance, and hopefully you're not seeing this video too late.
I love everything you just said. I think that net, where I kind of come out on this from, our episode topic here was going to be that this law changed, and that it used to be everyone had to be in agreement. Now it's just majority rule. So if that's 3 siblings in the family, that means only 2 of you have to agree to get this approval of cost. I think that probably that shift automatically creates a sort of floodgate of like, I've got my majority, I can go do whatever I want, which is probably going to create potential for more claims and more mistakes. So if you're on the cemetery side, make sure to follow best practices. I think we laid out some amazing ones today. And as always, and with anything you do in life, do your due diligence when you're buying any product or service, especially if you're engaging with a funeral home or cemetery.
Absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree.